Started. My name is Erin Cobain. I'm the UDM Law Review Symposium Director. And I want to welcome you all here and say thank you. I'm glad that we're all finally here after a lot of hard work, and I'm pleased to have you all here as speakers and attendees. But at this time, I'm going to introduce Dean Phyllis Crocker to give some welcomes and opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. This is a great day to have the symposium on formative assessment. I'm Phyllis Crocker, the Dean. I have the privilege of being the Dean of this great law school. I'm so glad we're having this conversation today. Law schools, as you all know, have been slow to embrace formative assessments, but really, what could be more important than checking in with our students and making sure they're learning what we actually hope they're learning? So I'm glad that you all are doing work on student learning and look forward to hearing your insights today. Want to thank Erin for pulling all of this together. Thank you. And also thank Denise Hickey, our Assistant Dean for Alumni Relations, and is Shamila?
She's coming in a minute.
Okay, Shamila Khan, who you will meet during the day, is our Assistant Dean for, our Director for Student Affairs, and then also Professor Julia Bellion, who's one of our faculty advisors, right there. So enjoy the day. Thank you.
Not because I want it, but because my marketing department does. As Dean Crocker said, I'd like to thank Dean Crocker for having us, and I'd like to welcome you to Detroit Mercy Law School, and thank you for. She left. Oh no, there she is. Erin, I think if you think about being a student and running something like this, it's a pretty amazing experience, and you've done an amazing job. She's been a pleasure to work with. And I think it's been seamless. As the co-director for the Institute for Law Teaching and Learning, I'm happy to be here. And we are very, very, very excited to be part of any symposium that talks about formative assessment, because the Institute for Law Teaching and Learning has been interested in this before it was popular to be interested in this, and this has been the area of my research and writing since I started at Gonzaga University in 2007. First things, let me introduce myself. I'm Sandra Simpson. I'm the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at Gonzaga University. I'm also an Associate Professor of Legal Research and Writing. And I'm the co-director of the Institute for Law Teaching and Learning, plus a mother of 2 busy teenagers and a wife of a wonderful husband. So, who is at home picking up the slack for me, taking soccer practice and driving people around. So I appreciate that. I also, to let you know a little bit about me, I hail from your neighboring state in Wisconsin. I'm from Green Bay, so I'm sorry for the Lions fans here, but I can't say I am a Lions fan. I'm very, very, very much a Packer fan, although the Lions are my second favorite team. My least favorite team, which I'm sure you can appreciate, is anyone who plays the Minnesota Vikings. Sorry if you're from Minnesota, I just don't like the Vikings. If you don't know what the Institute for Law Teaching and Learning is, we are a nonprofit organization started at Gonzaga in 1991. And it was started by Jerry Hess, who's an icon and now one of our retired professors, an icon in this area. We've been joined by Bowen School of Law in 2013 and by Washburn in 2008. And so the three of our schools co-direct this institute. We travel around the country and abroad helping law professors learn how to teach, which is really what we do. As teachers, we like to teach. And so helping that has been one of my greatest honors. We sponsor 2 conferences a year. The next one is in 3 weeks at Emory, University in Atlanta, so I hope to see most of you there. And our next one is over the July, well, it's actually not the July 4th holiday, it's July 7th and 8th and it's on teaching professional skills in the law school classroom. And that will be at Bowen at University of Arkansas and Little Rock. And everybody wants to go to Little Rock in July. I understand the weather's great. That's what I understand. If you're interested in any of our consulting services, you can look at our website at lawteaching.org. And so that's my little pitch for the Institute. So let's talk about why we're here. There we go. If you look at the website that Aaron and the Law Review have put up, those are the 3 things they want us to talk about today, that we're going to talk about. Discussing formative assessment, discussing our student outcomes, and contemplating how this will affect our student experience. I'm mostly really excited about the 3rd question, because I think that the ABA is requiring us to do the formative assessment, which I think is a good idea, but really discussing why, contemplating how this will affect our student experience is really the meat of the matter. And I'm so proud of the Law Review for coming up with that question. We all talk about formative assessment, but how does it help student learning? And I think that that's really what we want to talk about. So first I will talk about formative assessment for a minute. I told Aaron I need 11 minutes, 29 seconds. So we started a little bit late, so I'll try not to talk fast. When we talk about formative assessment at breakfast, I was talking with one of our distinguished colleagues here, and we were talking about our kids. And I was telling him that my husband's been my son's soccer coach since he was little. He's 14 and too good for my husband now, so he has a different coach. And one of the other his other little soccer buddies they're not little anymore. They're all both 5'10", but I still call them the little guys. They were in the back seat. We're going up to our ski place in the Rockies last weekend. And Chase, not my son, but the friend, says to my husband, well, Coach, I wish you were still my coach. And my husband said, well, why? And he said, well, our coach now just screams and says, do it better. But he never tells us how to do it better. And my husband looked at me and he said, that's you, informative assessment. Because when my little guy was 6 and my husband was coaching him, my husband would be screaming, hey, stop. I have to, this is a quote. Am I being recorded? Okay, well this is a quote. Quit dicking around with the ball in front of the goal. And I thought, I hope all the other parents didn't hear that, but the kids knew what that meant. Stop messing around with the ball in front of the goal. You want to mess around with the ball, do it over there, not in front of the goal. And so ever since that time, he talked to me about, how do you teach? How do you teach kids how to play soccer? And Chase told him, Coach, the best thing you ever said to me was, if someone's coming towards you, don't go up, because then they can go around you. You got to back out. And so he was telling him the skills. That's formative assessment. How do you reach the goals that you want your kids to get? And so for me, formative assessment is really where it's at. We're going to learn many things today on formative assessment, which is very good. I'm very excited. I'm starting to sound like the president. Maybe that's too soon. The ABA has defined formative and summative assessment very narrowly. Formative assessment means anything throughout the semester or in the culmination of your legal career, or not at the culmination, anytime during your legal career that helps you gives you meaningful feedback on what you're learning as a student. And summative assessment is only defined as culmination of a course or your legal career. We all know that formative and summative assessment aren't that clear, and we can use them for both things, but those are the definitions we have to go to. So today, we're going to hear from James McGrath out of Texas A&M. He's going to talk to us about planning our classrooms to maximize formative assessment. Sue Liemer out of Southern Illinois will talk to us about Bloom's taxonomy and how it fits into assessment, which I think is really interesting. I use Bloom's taxonomy all the time in my classroom. Renee, Nicole Allen out of the University of Tennessee and Alicia Jackson out of Florida A&M are going to talk to us about engaging millennials in formative assessment. God, I can't wait. I got 2 millennials at home, and I am really excited for that presentation. I could go on. In fact, I'm going to. Ruth Crocker out of Ohio, University Moritz of Law, will talk about formative assessment and a case study. We even have Dr. Andrew Noble from the UK talking to us about formative peer review. I thought, wow, the UK. I'm complaining about taking a red-eye back to Spokane tonight so I can go to WSU with my daughter tomorrow for her nerd orientation, which is what I call it. But he's got to go back to the UK. Lastly, David Siegel out of New England will enlighten us on how to perform, or how performing students are affected by formative assessment. So I think that's pretty exciting. There we go. So now that, wait a second, here we go, back up. ABA Standard 314, which is what we all know, right? We all know and love it. We are going to learn a lot of things about that. Was that just up there? See, I'm behind. My daughter says, Mom, how do you do that? How do you get up and talk in front of people? I'm like, not well. So let's get warmed up a little bit. Calvin's one of my favorites because my son is Calvin. My son told me about 2 years ago when he was 12, and I told him, hey Mitch, I love you. And he goes, of course you love me, I'm your greatest accomplishment. Okay. He's just like Calvin. So let's get warmed up. I want you to take a minute to just jot down what types of formative assessment you might use in the classroom. So just take a minute. I didn't bring my timer for a minute. I got it. Okay, that was a minute. It seems like an eternity when you're standing up here. I always have to use my clock to make sure that I give them actually 2 minutes or a minute. So, volunteers, what kind of formative assessment are we already using? Yes?
A lot of us take weekly quizzes in some of our classes.
What kind of quizzes?
Like weekly or bi-weekly quizzes.
And do you get feedback on that?
Yes.
On how you're doing?
Yes.
Do you do that online or in class or by clickers?
It depends.
Depends on the professor? Awesome. Anybody else? Oh, come on, you're law professors. Yeah.
So having the students work in small groups and then reporting back to the whole class what the result of their small group work was and having the whole classroom to do that.
And do you critique it as well?
Just in the context of class.
Guide the critique from the others. Anybody else? Yeah.
Clicker quizzes.
Ah, yes. And so does the clicker quiz show why it's right or wrong, or do you talk about why it's right or wrong?
A little bit.
Yeah, so see, we're all using a formative assessment already. So we all know what it is. So the idea is getting new ideas. And again, okay, this is my last, I think, it's my last pitch for the Institute. In Emory, on the 25th, we are going to do formative assessment in large classrooms. So, because that's the problem with fatigue for professors. So, but if you want other ideas, I think you're going to learn them today. Because as I was looking at what people are going to do, Julia Bellian and Karen McDonald Henning out of Detroit Mercy, yay, will talk to us about using bar-style essay questions for formative assessment. We'll also learn about methods of incorporating formative assessment into the classroom from Julie St. John from Detroit Mercy. And lastly, Jennifer Sprung out of St. Mary's University will bring us innovative ways to create an authentic first-year learning experience. And I've seen that presentation. It's actually quite fascinating. At the Institute, we call this the circly slide. Well, that's kind of funny. We call that the circly slide because this is what we do in outcomes assessments. And I'll touch on outcomes assessment a little bit. It's just a fancy word of what do you want your students to learn when they leave the law school and how do we get them there? That's what your outcomes are. The competencies that you come up with are how we get them to those learning outcomes. And it's really interesting because I was looking at what people are doing, and Doshia, yes, perfect, hi, how are you? I didn't see you at breakfast. She, out of Texas Southern, Thurgood Marshall of Law, is going to talk to us about incorporating those outcomes into our classrooms. And I'm going to speak about institutional outcomes in my presentation. And how many of your schools have your institutional outcomes already done and published on your website? Nice. How about competencies that go with it? Got it? All right, we are ahead of the game. But that's what we do first. We're going to identify those competencies, or identify those outcomes. And now we know what the students, we want our students to know. And the next step is to translate them into competencies. And that's the tough one. You have to think about what skills, knowledge, and values our students have to have and master in order to get that outcome. And you'll see, I will bring Gonzaga's outcomes and competencies for you guys to look at today. And it's by no means the best practices. It's what we've come up with. We think it's good, but we welcome you to use it if you want to. We're going to learn about one of our measuring tools, which is rubrics. We're going to learn about that today from Joni Larson out of Indiana Tech Law School. And then we turn to, after we do our rubrics, we turn to mapping our curriculum. Where in the curriculum are we teaching, introducing, learning, and assessing those outcomes, which I'll touch on today. And then lastly, we assess how our students are doing in obtaining those outcomes. And if they aren't attaining them, we go back to those outcomes again. That's why it's a circly slide. That's what we call it. Because I said to the co-directors, I got to do this opening, what should I use? I use the circly slide. But all right. So why do we do this? Of course, we do this to help create better learning environments for our students. Elizabeth Bloom out of New England Law will talk about reshaping our teaching and learning in our classrooms. And we'll round things out with Elizabeth Usman and Abigail DeBlaise out of Belmont, which will talk to us about shifting the focus to student learning and how that can positively affect our students' mental health. Oh my God, who doesn't want that, right? I wanted to improve my mental health, so this will be good. I would be remiss if I didn't touch on assessment from the teacher fatigue standpoint. I think that's a big concern, and from the freedom, academic freedom standpoint. Victoria, my seatmate, was going to be talking about ABA mandates and academic freedom. Again, this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I'm so honored to be here, and I really welcome you to this symposium, and I hope we're going to learn some great things, which I think we will. And I'm looking forward to conversations over breaks and lunch, and hopefully I will see you in Emory at the end of the month. Thank you.
So everyone in the next panel, help yourself, grab a mic, get your tent.
Should just start. Somebody go lead us. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first session as we get settled in here. The title of this session is In Theory, This Will Work, Cognitive Science and Learning Theory Bases for Formative Assessment. So I want to give a great thanks to Sandra, who did my job for me, so I don't have to do this introduction. So here we have James McGrath, Sue Liemer, Renee Allen, and Alicia Jackson, who will be talking. Thank you.
Good morning. Love that. So my title is a little bit misleading because it's really the title of like a 45-minute type of presentation, but I'll try to get to as much of it as I can. one thing I like to stress at our school is that I try to get the whole faculty involved with the work that we do in academic support. I'm on the faculty, I teach torts and a couple of other classes, but getting the students to a place where they're expecting regular assessment has been kind of a hard fight. And so I have a great team. I just want to do a shout out to Kamisha, to Shud. The three of us are academic support, along with our 24 academic support TAs. And one big lesson we tell our students all the time when they come in, because they're all very bright people, and they know how to learn, they know how to do well in school, that we have to remind them that law school is very different, and that we're asking them to do different things in law school than they've done before. And I'll admit, some of the things in academic support that we tout sound pretty damn fuzzy, right? Very fluffy, you know? But they're really actually backed in some hard science. Like things like mindset really matters. If you really believe that you can do something, if you really believe that numbers aren't destiny, maybe your LSAT wasn't as high as you wanted it to be, you can overcome that with hard work. If you adopt that mindset, and it's true, you're likely to do better, and you'll see working hard as a good thing that'll get you somewhere, versus if you have a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset, you'll see extra hard work as fruitless, a waste of time, and we really need to make sure that students realize that's not just touchy-feely stuff, that's actual science, as is self-efficacy, the belief that you can do something. If you believe you can do something, you're more likely to be able to do it, and if you don't believe you can do something, I'm pretty sure you probably won't be able to do it. So it's very simple and very foundational in the kind of work we do. One more, and then I'm going to get on to something else here, is attribution style. You know, this is really important. It's your characteristic tendencies on how you're going to infer the cause of things that happened to you or things you did. So someone with a pessimistic style will say something like, oh, I didn't do well on that exam. You know, maybe the professor had it in for me, maybe didn't do so well. Whereas an optimistic person will say something more like, well, I didn't do as well in that exam, but if I work hard, I can do well in the next one. So half full versus half empty. And then there's the legal realist. Never mind. So I know we're talking about assessment today, and so I thought I'd talk about the ABA standards a little bit, but it's going to be done to death, so I'm going to leave it alone. Regardless, I do want to just talk a little bit about it because it kind of is the anchor and the foundation for a lot of what I'm trying to do at our school. We started, of course, like you, with program assessment, and it's really, it can be an awful exercise, or it can be a chance to really think about what kind of lawyers you want to create and how you're going to get there. And you can use the same tools in your classroom assessment as well. And assessment seems kind of a bad word, but I want to remind everybody the root comes from the Latin, which I'm not going to pronounce, which means to sit beside and to counsel. How are you doing? You're doing pretty well. We're going to get you to the next step. So it should be a very positive thing when we look at assessment. And here's the wheel that Sandra put up earlier, a little bit more detail for program assessment. And I like to use this in my class as well. The ABA wants us to focus on learning versus just teaching, right? It's very easy to stand up and teach, but how much are people really learning? And how do people learn is the real question. And if you haven't read one of these books, I highly recommend them. There's one called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning and How We Learn. If you're in the ACE, the Academic Support Group, you probably have seen these books. You probably were given one. One of the bar companies gave out copies of How We Learn a couple years back. And they talk about some of the very counterintuitive ways that people actually learn better. And when I'm talking about learning better, I mean for the long term. I think every student that comes to law school is an expert on passing tests. And that's great, but we need students to learn for the long term because they're going to be professionals. They're going to be out there, people's lives, people's money in their hands. All this work is based upon cognitive science, educational science, and there's a seminal article a few years back that looked at decades and decades of cognitive science and did this big meta-analysis on what really works if we want to learn for the long term. And it was very well received in the science communities. It's like 80 to 100 pages, I can't remember, it's long, but you don't have to read the whole thing. You can read the books that I talked about, which are beautiful little narratives, stories that fill out the gaps, or you can read the 6-page Scientific American version by the same authors. And if I was to try to cull this down, what do we know about learning? How do people learn? If I had to put it really simply, I would say that learning is hard work. So I started out by talking about our program, how we try to get the faculty on board. Because the message has to be, effective long-term learning is hard work. You have commercial companies coming in to tell your students, I can tell you how to do this the easy way. And there's certainly easy ways to do everything. But the easy way is not the best way, right? You've got to put in the hard work. I want to say this about 15 times, but the right way is sometimes very counterintuitive. And people have, come up with very intuitive ways of trying to help students. One very intuitive way is these learning styles. And learning styles are, how people prefer to learn. There's a whole bunch of them. And for a long time, people were really stressing these learning styles as a great way to get students to learn better. But there's really no evidence that they learn better with their learning styles. Maybe they like it better, but they don't necessarily learn better. And there's a bunch of reasons why you can read in the literature on this. But the big reason, I think, is not because there's a cat, and there's plenty of cats coming, is because it's easy to do your style. Your style is, I would rather sit back and watch something than to do the hard work of reading and doing exercises, because that's what I prefer. People tend to prefer things that are easier. And what do we know about learning? If we know anything, it's hard work. So learning styles, to me, are kind of anathema, relying upon them as a way of enhancing our learning. And even the people who do empirical work on learning styles say an eclectic mix of learning styles is best. If you're an auditory learner, you should be doing visual and a little kinesthetic as well. You should be dancing about the rule of perpetuities. That's true. No. You can do whatever you want, but mix it up is the whole point. So there are many very effective ways of learning and some not so effective ways. And because, again, and I say this not just because you're here, law students are smart, right? And they know what works for them. So getting them to change their practices is really hard. It's very difficult. And then you'll have well-meaning colleagues that'll be pushing that rock back down the hill while you're trying to move that immovable object. So counterintuitive. The most popular way of studying for exams, of course, is cramming or mass studying near the end of the semester, maybe a week before the exam. And students do it because it works. Very ineffective at long-term learning. They'll do well on that test, but that's not the point. In law school, especially for law school, because any professional, of course, you want them to retain the knowledge. But in law school, they've got that 2 or 3 day test at the end, the bar exam, where they need a strong foundation of this law. They need to retain it, so that when we get to post-graduation, they don't have to relearn everything. Other couple of quick examples. The highlighting method, I don't know if you've seen this. I'm not saying don't use highlighters. I was misunderstood by my students saying that. I use highlighters all the time. But there's a method of learning where you highlight the stuff you don't know and go back and read it later. And it sounds like a good idea, except now you're going back and looking at the hard part, and you're reading it out of context. And you're not getting the connections to the stuff you do know. And you know what chunking is. Chunking is relating what material you're learning to stuff you already know. It builds strong attachments in your brain so you can get that material out when you need it. And I promise more of these. And this is the best thing I could do for a slide for reading and rereading and rereading. The most popular way of studying, one of the least effective ways of learning material in the long term. And the reason why people think they work is everybody, pretty much, is not really very good at self-assessment. It's a skill that really has to be learned. And people in this room today, it's like the choir. I know you're all going to be giving lots of assessment, which will, of course, help the students become better self-assessors. I decided to talk about a few of the highly effective teaching methods. One of my learning methods, excuse me, these are for your students. I'll talk about how you can incorporate them into your class as quickly as I can. Retrieval is a very powerful way of learning. So you can read your torts book over and over again, but if you're reading it for the first time and you see the rule for battery, an intentional act that causes a harmful offensive contact to the person or the other, you can read that and keep going, and you can say, oh, I got that. But do you have that? So if you get a rule, you want to cover that up with a piece of paper or your hand and try to bring it back. An intentional act. And the more you struggle, the more work you put into recalling it at that moment, the stronger the connection you make in your brain. And it doesn't take that much time. And if you can't get it, well, go ahead and look at it. Because what happens is we read something, and if we read it over and over again, we have this illusion of knowledge where we think we know something because, oh, battery, I read that before, I remember that. No, you probably don't. You're reading it again, and your mind says, oh, I know this because I've seen this before, but you don't remember it, likely, unless you've done something to really ingrain it into your brain. Of course, these are true illusions. Those lines are the same length in the Ponzo and the Muller-Lyer illusion. And of course, in the Herring illusion, they are actually parallel. The point is, we can fool ourselves, right? So to really be learning, you really need to be engaged in the material. Sorry. That's so wrong. One of these highly effective learning techniques, you'll see this in undergraduate books, and now I'm starting to see it in law texts as well, is something called generation. It's also known as priming. And you'll see in some, at the beginning of a chapter, let's say it's on organic chemistry, it'll ask the students questions about organic chemistry who have never read about organic chemistry. Why would you do that? Because it's a highly effective learning technique. What it does is get students thinking, what do these words mean? How can I relate this to what I know? It sounds like something. I know, and I'm going to think this is what the answer is. And if they get it right, great. And if they get it wrong, then they learn the answer as they're reading. And what they've done is they've created a space in their mind to attach that language to something they already know, that new knowledge, excuse me. They've attached it to something they already know. And the more firmly attached, the more connections you make in your brain, the more likely you'll remember it when you need it. And finally, reflection is another really strong learning technique. And I advise my students to do this on their own all the time. I do it in my classroom. You can do this very easily. It's where you reflect upon what you've been doing. If you're studying, just take a minute at the end of your study break and think about what it is that you've learned, what's important. Write down the 3 most important things you learned. Try to recall things. It's a little bit of both reflection and retrieval. In my classroom, I know some of you do this. A lot of you do a lot of these things automatically because you're good teachers. But you can give them an exit ticket exercise. Say, take out a piece of paper to get out of the classroom. You've got to turn in an exit ticket, and in 1 minute, write down everything you learned today, or the 3 things that are most important, or the thing that is the most unclear. And whose assessment is that? That's yours. All right? So now you know what your students don't understand. So we're getting a little bit of assessment for both of us. I would feel really remiss. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I do want to give you a quiz. So here it is. You have a test 1 week from today, and let's say you only have 4 hours to study between now and then. What is the best use of those 4 hours of study time? Put in one concentrated 4-hour study session 3 days before the test. No one picks that, because if I'm going to cram closer to the test. That's a bad one. Stay up late cramming the night before the exam so the material is fresh. And that'll probably get you a good score. But that's not the right answer. C, study 1 hour a night for the 4 consecutive nights until the test. And that's really appealing. And it talks about some very well-known effects, the primacy and recency effect, right? When you sit down to study or you're in a class, you're likely to remember the first few things someone says or you read, and the last few things. So this gives you 4 chances at the first things and the last things. So instead of 1 first thing and 1 last thing, there are 4 first things and 4 last things. More likely you'll remember it. Pretty good answer. But the right answer, surprisingly enough, is D, study 2 hours tomorrow night and 2 hours 2 nights later. This takes advantage of something called spacing or space practice or distributed practice. It's because our brains are working 24/7. Even though we're not thinking about it in the day off, our mind is trying to make connections. I know you've woken up thinking about something that's perplexing you in the middle of the night, and your brain is still working on whatever that problem was. And this is based on groundbreaking science from 1884, Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, right? He knows that people quickly start to lose things. But if you revive them at intervals, we see we get better retention, better learning. And the timing really matters. If we actually start reviewing something directly after class, we see that the end result is not much different than if we hadn't reviewed at all. Better to wait a certain amount of time. And luckily, people have done work to say what the right amount of time is. So here's why distributed practice is so important in 1 minute. This is 2 people spending the same amount of time studying, and this person does it the usual way by cramming at the end. This person does it spaced learning. And we see this is the exam time. And look what happens. The person cramming does about the same, sometimes 1%, 2% better. But 2 weeks after the exam, they'll retain 10 to 15% of that knowledge versus 40 to 60% if you use spaced practice. And that's the kind of foundation of knowledge I'm trying to build into our students so that when they get to the bar exam, they don't have to redo everything. We're also working with this reactivation curve. It's beyond the scope of this discussion. I was going to tell you a whole bunch of things in the last 30 seconds. You can build these into your syllabus. This is my torts syllabus. My torts exam was on December 9th. So my very first section was on intentional torts. It ended on September 14th. So there's a little chart in these books. They're online. I'll send you one. You can figure out the optimal time to go ahead and review that material. It would be 2 weeks later. So on my syllabus, there's a multiple choice intentional torts quiz 2 weeks after the end of intentional torts. And I build others in all during the semester. If you haven't seen this book, I strongly recommend it. It's called Small Teaching. So if you don't have time to read the first book, get this one, because it talks about the cognitive science and gives you concrete examples on how to use it. Really great. I was going to talk about student motivation. I had a funny slide or two. But I just want to say this. Sorry. We're trying to get from surface learning to deep learning. And law schools and schools have changed over the years. And I promise it's going to be a long wrap-up, but it's almost over. This happened in the undergraduate schools as well about 20, 30 years ago, where we started enrolling more students than we used to have in undergraduate education. And instead of getting really well-prepared students who came from families where education was king and they were intrinsically motivated to do the work, they had to start motivating students to be better learners. And the same thing, I think, and I don't want to make too much of this, but a lot of law professors are very intrinsically motivated to do the work. And we have to remember that not everybody coming to law school is intrinsically motivated. We have to meet our students where they are. And we can always complain that they are not motivated. They are incredibly motivated, but it's maybe not by the things that we're motivated by. So we need to really up our game to make sure that we're bringing them along. And 15 more slides would have better explained that, but I know we've got plenty to do here. Another book I strongly recommend. It's really not for law professors, but it'll blow your mind about teaching in general. And I'm not going to say a darn thing about Bloom's taxonomy, because I know Sue is going to do that. Thank you very much. I apologize. I insisted on using my own laptop. Sorry about that.
Okay. I was frankly very surprised when my paper was chosen to speak to you about, because it's a little different. But the foundational part of the paper, I think, is going to be helpful for everybody, I hope, although I may go through that a little quickly. I teach at Southern Illinois University, and I do not have a degree in education, but I am very lucky. The other two, I teach legal writing, and the other two legal writing professors do have degrees in education. In fact, they're the only faculty members at our law school who have degrees in education. So they basically, all the things I've done intuitively over the years, they've taught me how to use the jargon of people who have degrees in education, which is a lot of what this assessment jargon is, right? Can you guys hear me without? I'm not used to standing behind a microphone. I'm used to walking around talking to law students. I'm going to take that wire down any minute. Okay. They taught me when you start a lesson plan, and yes, you have a lesson plan. You don't just say, read the next two cases. When you start a lesson plan, you start with a learning objective, because how can we assess something if we don't know what our objective was, right? The assessment is whether we met our objective. Okay, so, and we write those in terms of learning, not teaching, and I've seen this as a senior faculty member. I sometimes observe junior faculty and have to write a review of their teaching, and they have to tell me what the teaching objective for that class session was, and sometimes they write down what the learning objective was, and they write down a teaching objective, cover such and such. No, a learning objective, right? So the basics, a learning objective is simply what should students know, value, or do? What do you want them to know by the time you finish the class session? What do you want them to be able to do or to have an appreciation for that they didn't have when they first started? So that's simply what a learning objective is. Sorry, I do this in my own classroom. I trip over furniture all the time. Okay, so there's this thing called Bloom's taxonomy. And again, I don't have a degree in education, but when I go to these legal writing professors' conferences, they're all about learning stuff, right? Learning theory, we've learned a little bit about the cognitive science behind it. Bloom's taxonomy has nothing to do with cognitive science, at least as far as I know. It was actually written the first part of it was done in 1954 by Mr. Benjamin Bloom and a committee of professors who all had PhDs in education. And it's basically, I've been told it's learning theory. I don't know. I didn't take the course as an undergraduate or as a PhD candidate. But I see it as a tool. I see Bloom's taxonomy as a tool for professors, especially law professors. And it's simply a hierarchy of learning objectives. Once you figure out, here's what I want my students to know, let's put those skills and different objectives in some kind of order. And what James showed you, that pretty triangle, that's the way you usually see it. And you usually see at the apex, the highest, most sophisticated learning objective, and then the basic ones are down at the bottom, right? That makes sense, it's a pyramid. And somehow when I type this out, this will show you that I'm more left brain than right brain. Whatever most law professors are, I'm the opposite. When I type this out, I went in the opposite order, so I apologize for that. But all this is, there's no magic here. When I first heard about it, I thought, oh wait, we have to do it that way. There's no magic here. There's other ways to say, let's organize learning objectives, right? It's just a tool for all of us. Okay, so there's these 3 different domains which most people don't realize. We do have some nice literature now from law professors about using Bloom's taxonomy in the law school classroom. All of it focuses pretty much on the cognitive domain, and there's a reason for that. That's where we have all the abstract thinking skills, all those higher level cognitive skills, which is what we're trying to teach our law students all day long in almost every single course, right? And so when you hear most law professors talk about Bloom's taxonomy, they're usually talking about the cognitive domain, the thinking skills. And we know that American law schools are really, really good at this because we have the Carnegie report that shows that we're really good at teaching these students these cognitive skills. But when Bloom and his committee first proposed this, they had more than one domain. This is just their lingo. I don't think there's any magic to that either. They also talked about the affective domain, which talks about feelings and emotion, and that's when I said, what do you want the students to know? That would be the cognitive domain. What do you want the students to value? That's the affective domain. What do they value? What do they appreciate? How do they feel about these things? And that happens in a lot of law school classes, just sort of intuitively. A lot of law professors, as they teach, will be telling students about sort of the ethical choices behind a particular way of solving a particular problem or approaching something. Certainly when you're taking professional responsibility class or clinic or a leadership class and those sorts of things, anything where you're talking about creating your professional identity, that would be in the affective domain of Bloom's taxonomy. And the part that I'm writing about is actually further out there. It's the psychomotor domain, and I've done it with and without the hyphen in these slides because I've seen it both ways. And I don't know which one is correct. I don't know if it is. And that really means using the senses in the body. And this is a sort of out there thing for some law professors because we're training brains, right, to be lawyers. But brains inhabit bodies, and bodies support brains. And if we totally ignore that, of course, then we're doing the students a disservice. And so I wanted to make a point to say, for those of you who are kind of more junior faculty or not yet faculty, but maybe want to be faculty someday, when you write the article, it doesn't have to be the theory of everything. It just has to be the next little piece. So this is just, my article is really just the next little piece. It's just that psychomotor domain part. Okay, so really quickly on the cognitive domain, this is like you take a whole course when you're in the School of Education on this, right? The first level is to remember. You know, did you memorize the rule against perpetuities, right? The next level is to comprehend. Do you have any clue what the words mean, right? And these words are different. You'll see different versions of this. It was originally written, the cognitive domain, I believe, was 1954, and then it's 1956. And it's been updated since, and some people use different words. And yes, there's scholarship out there attacking it or saying which parts are good and which parts are bad or whatever. It's all okay. It's just a tool, right? And we use it for what it's helpful for. The next level is to apply. Can you give the students a simple problem about the rule against perpetuities, then they might be able to apply the rule to it. Analyze. Can we come up with a more complex problem where they have to figure out some things that aren't really obvious? Synthesize. Do we have some exceptions to the rule against perpetuities, or we have some refinements to the rule against perpetuities? Now the students have to bring everything together and synthesize. You probably do that in lots of courses after you have a series of cases, and now we've got them all together to create the current state of the law. In legal writing class, for those of you who are legal writing professors, and those of you sitting here, that's the rules section, right, of the IRAC where we synthesize, and then evaluate. You know, when the students get so advanced that they can read that judge's decision and see, you know, the judge said she's doing this, but really, when you see what she did, she was doing that. That kind of level of actually being able to evaluate the material. And as I said, it usually looks like the pretty pyramid that James had up there, where evaluate is up there at the apex of the pyramid, but my brain looks at things a little differently. Okay, and that's the part that most of you, if you've heard about Bloom's taxonomy, are probably familiar with. We have the affective domain, and one of the critiques, by the way, of Bloom's taxonomy is that some of these overlap, and sometimes a particular learning task that you ask a student to do will fall into more than one of these domains. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not meant to be this sort of strict categorization of things. We're not, you know, doing the Dewey Decimal System or something here. Everything doesn't have to fit neatly. We just use this as a tool to help us think through, you know, what level are our students at? Oh, just to go back for a second, real quickly. We used to assume when students came into law school that the sort of remember, comprehend part, that was kind of a given. And then we were going to start teaching them pretty quickly how to apply the law, analyze the law, synthesize the law, and evaluate what was going on in the world of law. And some of us are finding that these days sometimes we're going a little further back, especially if you're doing some academic support work, that even basic memorization skills, sometimes we're going way back there to help students with those sort of things. And that's just sort of a trend that we've been seeing. So in the affective domain, students first have to be able to be receptive to the sort of emotional state or their own personal reaction to what's going on, and then they respond. They learn to put values on things. If there's certain behavior we assume attorneys will have, and they'll learn to value that type of behavior. We'll have civil discourse even though we disagree with each other, that sort of thing. And then they'll learn how to organize all of the above, and it all comes together to characterize. And this, in the lingo of Bloom's taxonomy, characterize really means creating character. It literally means creating character, and for law schools, this is a nice fit because we want to create professional identities for our students. We don't create it, we want to help them and guide them in creating their own professional identities. And so most of you who teach law are probably helping students with some of these learning objectives already, even though you might not actually have them in the lesson plan. You might not be having your lesson plan that you're teaching ethical considerations about the law, or, you know, how should the policy go in the law, that sort of thing, even though you're talking about it all the time. If you're talking about social reform, if you're talking about social justice, if you're talking about the policies behind the law, all of that could fit into the student's sense of what it means to be a lawyer, what our role is as professionals out there in the society. And all of that goes to the affective domain, right? We're not teaching particular thinking skills. They're gaining a sense of who they are as professionals. The part that I focused on, which is a little more out there, is the psychomotor domain. So I want to ask you to play along with me for just 60 seconds and do what I ask my students to do. When we are about 45 minutes, 50 minutes into a class, because I tend to teach for an hour and 15-minute class session, I ask everybody, as you are able, to please stand up. Please reach for the ceiling and have a 7th inning stretch. Really reach for the ceiling. Get the oxygen going. Doesn't that feel good? Yeah. Okay, sit down. Thank you. So why did I do this? Why did I do this? Volunteers? To wake you up, yes? Okay. By the way, if you're teaching after lunch, this is a great thing to do. The first time, some of you looked at me like I'm crazy, like she's gonna make me stand up and my shirt's gonna go up and my belly button's gonna show. Right? That's what I always worry about, you know. And the students look at me like I'm crazy the first time I do this. And then after that, every time I do it, it's like I have to yell at them practically, not really, but I have to kind of repeat, please sit down now. They love it. What you guys have just done is learning in the psychomotor domain, basically. I don't put into my lesson plan a learning objective of having a 7th inning stretch, but we could take these aspects that, and I'm going to unpack this in a second, we could take these aspects, these student learning objectives that are in the psychomotor domain, and we could consciously sprinkle them throughout our lesson plans. I'm not saying it's going to be every lesson plan, I'm not going to be saying it's going to be every course, but we could remind students that they have bodies attached to their brains, right? And that's a good thing and could be useful. So if we're talking about the psychomotor domain, the first level of learning is perception. The first student learning objective would be perception. And I should say that Bloom and his committee, they never got around to doing. They talked about the psychomotor domain, but they never got around to listing the learning objectives within it. It was Elizabeth Simpson came along in 1971, and she fleshed this out. There are other ways of expressing a hierarchy of learning objectives in the psychomotor domain. A lot of them have to do with training athletes. I don't really think we're training athletes, or so professionals who are going to be on the stage, that sort of thing. And this one, Elizabeth Simpson, when she created this hierarchy, she was thinking of higher education. She didn't actually talk about lawyers, but she gives examples for things like dentists and architects and engineers. They actually have to do things in the physical world, right, to do their professions. And I think we could sprinkle legal education with a little bit of it. So perception is simply taking in information from your senses, right? And some of you have been on, he's through the moot court cards there, yeah. Some of you have been on, some of you may have stage experience, or you may have been on a team, some kind of sports team where you were on a field, and you have a really good sense of the space around you, right? But to give a quick example, maybe you're teaching trial ad, and the students are standing in the courtroom for the first time. A lot of students will only see the space right in front of them. They won't have a really good sense of all the places they can move. And maybe you just want to point that out to them and let them know it. And say, yes, lawyers are allowed to approach the jury that far, right? That's just basically a student learning objective in the psychomotor domain. Set is what you just did. You got set. You stood up and stretched. You got more oxygen coming to your brain. You raised your blood pressure a little bit. You became more awake. You got set. Think of when the starter gun goes off, when the starter says ready, set, go, right? You got set, mentally, physically set to do something. A guided response is simply when you're doing some sort of physical action or psychomotor action, and you as the teacher or the coach and the student has to follow you along. My example for this might be in that first year Socratic class that's really large, and some students can't speak in a way that projects their voice. Really hard for me, I have a soft voice. So to learn to speak in a way that projects the voice, maybe the contracts professor wants to take 30 seconds to address that. How do we do that? And if you have a problem with that, maybe we have a theater professor who comes in and does a little on the side thing after class for students, right? We want them to have that skill. Why don't we just teach it at the beginning instead of having them terrified and not so well equipped through the whole first year in all those big Socratic classes? We had a student one year who was so determined to learn how to do this, she started our local Toastmasters, and law students were participating in it. So I thought that was a great way to do it. Mechanism simply refers to when something becomes mechanical. You've got it in your muscle memory. Maybe if you're a moot court student, and you've learned to stand here instead of wiggling all over the place, and it's kind of, okay, I'm consciously thinking it through. He's telling me to talk faster. You don't want to tell somebody from New Jersey to talk faster. Complex overt response is the same as mechanism in that we now know how to do this thing, but it is more complex and we're more expert at it. It's not quite so basic. So maybe you're teaching a negotiation course and the students at some level learn, wait a minute, I've got to physically lean in more or physically lean back more, and they can actually see themselves, they can have a mental picture of what's my body language, am I using it purposefully, right? They're at that expert level of using their psychomotor skills in terms of their communications, their nonverbal communications. And finally, we have adaptation and origination. These are the two that Elizabeth Simpson added many years later. They're really easy to think of in terms of like performing arts, but it's really hard to think of examples for law students. For adaptation, the one thing I could think of was I worked as a lawyer in a state agency, and we would have agency hearings. And the lawyers who were used to trial work would come and represent the clients at the agency hearing. And basically we sat around a big table, and if they had an objection, all they had to say was, I object. But they were so trained to stand up and make this formal objection that they couldn't just sit at the table and look at the hearing officer and say, you know, officer, or Mr. So-and-so, I object. They were so trained, and in the moment they couldn't adapt, right? They had these ingrained psychomotor skills that they simply couldn't adapt to. I haven't thought of a law student example yet, but when you think of one, please tell me at lunch. And origination would be where a student can actually originate the whole whatever else is going on. If you were dancers, you'd be doing choreography. And the example I came up with was these brilliant law students who have done all this psychomotor work to put on this law symposium. Organizing all these bodies and spaces is a lot of psychomotor work. So that's an example I came up with. Maybe you can come up with a better one. That's what I'm writing about. This is the page that I'm writing about in my paper. And I'm not saying that we're going to go out and train Olympic athletes or train, professional dancers. But we do have bodies attached to our minds, and we can help our students learn those little pieces that make them even better at the work that they're going to do. Thank you.
To definitely thank Dean Crocker. We want to thank Aaron and the entire law review for inviting us here today. We're extremely excited to spend some time with you this morning talking about assessments. And you can tell by the smile on my face, I absolutely love this stuff, right? So we're excited to be here this morning, and we wanted to get a sincere thank you. The students have been consummate professionals the last few days. They have been concierges, they have been tour guides, so we definitely want to take a moment to say thank you. My name is Alicia Jackson. I'm the Associate Dean of Student Learning and Assessment, new title, right, at the Florida A&M University College of Law. My colleague, Professor Renee Allen, is the director of the Academic Success Program at Tennessee. Professor Allen and I had the pleasure of working together for 4 years at Florida A&M before we lost her, boo-hoo-hoo, right, to Tennessee. And we spent quite a few hours sitting in our offices talking about student learning. That was our thing. Coming from an academic support background, student learning is everything to us. We've been talking about assessment and outcomes and being outcome driven when it was unpopular, right? I remember 10 years ago when we were talking about the Bloom's Taxonomy and people were like, what is that, right? Now, everything is coming full circle thanks in part to the ABA standards. So a major part of our presentation will deal with the who are our students, what are the standards, why do we need the standards, and then how do we implement the standards in our classroom. A really quick story I thought about this morning. My dad came to visit. I have a 10-year-old who plays flag football for a church league, right? So we're at the game and my dad kept saying, what's the score? What's the score? Who's winning? Who's winning? And I'm like, Dad, they don't keep score. He said, well, wait a minute. How do you know who's going to win? And then every minute and 30 seconds they were shuffling kids in and out. And he kept saying, but wait a minute. He's doing really well or she's doing really well, right? And he kept asking why. Why are we doing these things? Why does every kid have to play the same amount of time? That's the reason why. It's those types of questions. My father reminds me of my colleagues. I spend my days and nights explaining why we do what we do. And the whole basis is all of that is based on who our students are. Who are the players on our team? Professor Allen?
Thank you. So, our students are these guys. You probably know them. Actually, most of you are them. So, in general, there are a lot of generalizations about generations, but in general, millennials are the generation born between the early 80s and about the year 2000. What's important to know about them, at least the good things, we'll start with the good first, is that they have an affinity for teamwork and collaboration. They're one of the most racially and ethnically diverse generations in the history of this country at least. And they have a progressive worldview. They see themselves as really citizens of the world versus just citizens of the United States. And that has a lot to do with their upbringing and the way that they were raised. And they have a lot of educational achievement. So they have a lot of degrees. But we'll talk about what that maybe really means in a bit. So these things shape millennials' worldview. And the most important thing about this is while they spent a ton of hours doing a lot of things, they spent under 5,000 hours reading books. And so their experience really has shaped the way they think, the way they communicate, and the way they learn. But I think that the most important thing about this slide and what's important to remember as we continue to educate them is that different does not mean incapable. And so it just means that we have to be more responsible about understanding who they are and understanding about the social landscape to which they come to law school with. So Net Genners are a cohort of millennials that were born in about the 90s. And what's special about Net Genners, as you can see by all these symbols, is that they were really the first generation of people to grow up in homes with technology, computers, and the internet. So they didn't just have the computer, but they also had the internet. So they had an access that no generation before them had to the whole world and to a vast amount of information. They also had more access by having this internet on cell phones to each other. And so these icons really demonstrate the primary mechanism that millennials communicate with each other, communicate with just people in their lives, and it's really the way they expect to communicate with us as their educators. You might know this about millennials. They've been coined the trophy generation. And so this is where it gets a little negative and sometimes uncomfortable, especially since there's so many millennials in the room. I'm usually preaching to the choir of my peers and colleagues, so I don't mean to offend you, millennials. But you have been coined the trophy generation. And really that means that there's this expectation of praise that comes from sports that Professor Jackson talked about. There's no score. Everyone's getting a trophy, whether you win or not. I don't really know how you determine the winner, but apparently everybody just gets a trophy and it's a good job. And so this expectation of praise comes with them really to law school. And that's important for us to know because I feel like praise is cheesy. But I've been able to work that into really the feedback that I give as a part of the formative assessment. The other thing you need to know about millennials is that they've been raised by what we're now calling helicopter parents. And as we look more into helicopter parenting, there's actually some new work about helicopter educators. And so not only are parents being helicopters, but in K through 12 and also continuing at the university level, educators are being helicopters. And what this means is the people in millennials' lives have swooped in to basically save them when they are in distress. And this has really led to an inability to independently problem solve. And lawyers are problem solvers, so this is particularly important to us. And then maybe one of the most important things about millennials is the No Child Left Behind Act that was enacted in 2002. And this is where we get the term teaching to the test. And so as an academic success person, I'm often talking about the bar exam, and what I get back from my colleagues is, oh no, we don't teach to the test here. That's not what we do. And so there's this very, very negative connotation about teaching to the test, which I think is really teaching, but it comes from here. Under the No Child Left Behind Act, because schools were measured by their performance on standardized tests, the focus really shifted from teaching these higher order critical thinking skills and developing them with students to just telling them what they need to know for the test and making sure that they can execute in a way that schools would be measured as being successful in their performance on these standardized tests. So taking all of that about millennials, I feel like I'm out of breath. I'm trying to stay on time. Taking all of that we know about millennials, we know that millennials learn best when there's quality student to faculty contact. And this quality comes down to more than just your office hours. Millennials are Googling you guys, just like I Googled most of the panelists last night. They want to know everything about you. I mean, they know you're a scholar, they can easily read your bio on a website and they know about your work, but they want to know something about you as a person. And that little nugget actually helps develop the quality of the student to faculty content. So you don't have to tell them your whole life, don't feel like this is an intrusion, but if you just give them a small nugget, it goes really far in engaging them along the way. Active learning and feedback, which we'll talk more about with the formative assessment. And then one of the things that I really want to point out, and this goes to different, not meaning incapable, is that they learn best when faculty members set high expectations. So a lot of times when people talk about generational differences and millennials, there's this implication that to teach them we have to dumb down education. And it's exactly the opposite. The expectation from millennials is that we set the bar high. They can meet it, but we have to set the bar high and be very explicit in those high expectations. So now that we know who they are, we'll talk a little bit about Standard 314 and assessment.
So back to my dad. My dad had a really good question. He said, but Alicia, if everybody's playing, if everybody's winning, how do you encourage them to get better, right? How do you help them move the ball along, right? And that's really what Standard 314 is designed to do. It's designed to make us do some introspection about moving the ball further. Standard 314, we've talked about it ad nauseum, right? It really is a test. The ABA wants to see law schools incorporate those summative and formative assessments throughout our curriculum. And I think that's really important to mention. It's throughout the curriculum. Also, the standard itself, it's a lot of latitude in how you do it. They're not saying in every single course you must have X number of summative assessments, X number of formative assessments. They're leaving it up to us to figure out how to do it. And it's really the conversation is what starts the ball moving. One of the things we did at our law school, for example, is we did a survey assessment. All the faculty had to complete this assessment, and the most interesting thing that came out of that conversation is I'd be on my way to the bathroom and one of my colleagues would say, oh my goodness, I didn't realize. It was the conversation. It was the process of going through and completing that survey that really, really helped to move the ball along at my law school in particular. It's important to talk about formative and summative together so that you can also see the distinction between the two. The first being formative assessment. The most important parts of the formative assessment really is the feedback. It's the notion that formative assessment is a circular process. There is no beginning and end. It is an ongoing process. Unlike summative assessments, where summative assessments really are a culmination. It's a test, a measure at the culmination of a course, for example, or even a bar exam. For many years, we have decided to use the bar exam as a measure of whether or not we have been effective in our program of legal education. The problem with that is it's not the most effective way to do it, hence the reason why we are back to formative assessments. Also, it's important to note that formative assessments, the creation of, Standard 314 was an outcry also from the legal profession. Big Law said, we don't like what you're sending to us. Right? You're sending to us a bunch of people that have memorized horn books and case books. They don't know how to do the higher order level of thinking, right? And so Standard 314 is designed to move that ball along. So how do we do there? How do we get there? One of the first things that we do is we have to stop and teach students how to be self-regulated learners. Yeah, self-regulated learners. What's that, right? Self-regulated learning is, again, a process. We're teaching them to be able to evaluate their own process. As much as formative assessment is designed for us to evaluate our work, the self-regulated learning cycle encourages students to do that work for themselves, right? We're making them those independent, higher order level thinkers through the self-regulated cycle. People often ask, but the self-regulated cycle, that sounds like a bunch of mumbo-jumbo. If you think that's a bunch of mumbo-jumbo, listen to the definition of metacognition, right? Metacognition is the ability to self-assess one's own knowledge or learning. But it's huge. As attorneys, that's what we do. We're lifelong learners, right? So we have to be able to be self-regulated learners. And the best place to start that conversation is in your classrooms in the first year of law school. As academic support professionals, that was one of the first things we introduced to students, how to be self-regulated learners. We moved away from the assumption that students coming into law school were already trained to be self-regulated learners. And maybe we were 25 years ago. But today things are different, in part because of the No Child Left Behind Act. Bloom's taxonomy, yes, it's back, right?
That's the right order.
And this is the order. The reason why we show the pyramid is because the pyramid simplifies, it simplifies thinking of Bloom's taxonomy in a hierarchy, right? There was the assumption initially that students came in at the bottom, right? They came in with understanding and remembering, or knowledge and comprehension. The taxonomy was actually revised. It was revised to include words like remembering, the memorization, the understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. What we love about the taxonomy is, the taxonomy, when you think about it in application to how you teach, the bottom two layers really represent issue spotting, right? Have they acquired enough knowledge in order to spot complex legal issues? The applying and analyzing, that's our application and also our rule, because of synthesis. Synthesis is tied into those two levels. So we have our I, our issue spotting, our rule, and our analysis in the middle of the pyramid. But at the end of the day, the most important part of that conversation is whether or not that analysis was sufficient enough for students to draw a conclusion, right? Whether or not they can evaluate on balance if everything they've done before the point of the evaluation was actually enough. This is important to talk about as it relates to student-centered versus teacher-centered. For many years in legal education, we have been teacher-centered, right? Teacher-centered classrooms where we did all the heavy lifting. And while we were moving up the pyramid, our students were not. The student-centered classroom is designed to do exactly that. It's to refocus our efforts on student learning versus just our teaching, right? One important part of this that I like to mention is the assessment method. When you think of the teaching center, that one-dimensional testing, what does that remind you of? Summative assessment, right? However, when you think about student-centered, it's multi-dimensional. It involves the student. It's moving the student up the hierarchy. Formative assessment cycle, step 1 is to administer tasks. What I want to mention about administering tasks, which is again the first part of the cycle, it's important to use the taxonomy as a basis for how you create your classes. The basis, when you're thinking about your syllabus, the first thing we look at are our learning outcomes. We work from the back and we work ourselves forward, right? Looking at what we want our students to learn. So as we're creating assessments or tasks in our classroom, we should think about how do we move them up the hierarchy. Unfortunately, because we haven't been thinking about the order of thinking and cognition, we have been focused on the bottom 2 layers or the top, and the middle has been obsolete or missing from how we develop our courses, how we develop our tests and our quizzes. Formative assessment really forces us to focus on the pyramid in its entirety. Step 2 is to examine student work. That has a lot to do with the feedback. Once we're able to evaluate our student work, we're able to give them the tools they need to fix and remediate. A wise man, I think it was Mahatma Gandhi, said, you can't fix what you don't acknowledge, right? Actually, it was Dr. Phil, but you can't fix what you don't acknowledge. So feedback allows our students the opportunity to remediate and fix said deficiencies. Informed teacher knowledge, which is so very important, which is how I trick my faculty members into doing things, right? I'm like, listen, it's gonna make us better, right? It makes us, we all as law faculty wanna be great, right? So this will help us to become better by focusing on our students in the front end and then inform our instruction. We then can make the changes we need necessary to move our students along. Just a picture of the cycle because we like, as you can tell as law professors, we like things that are ongoing. Examine student work, administer tasks, examine student work, inform teacher knowledge, and inform instruction. So how do we get there? What are some strategies?
All in 1 minute, by the way.
There you go, you got it.
So I'll try very quickly just to really draw the connection between the levels of Bloom's taxonomy, moving up the taxonomy, and millennials, because I think that's where we want to end up. So one way, when you're talking about understanding and remembering at the bottom of that pyramid, this is a great area where you can really leverage technology to engage the millennials in your classroom. And so here are just a couple resources, and one of the resources we're actually using today, it's called Prezi. So, I'm not throwing any shade, but you might want to check this out if you're still using PowerPoint. It is definitely, PowerPoint's okay, it's okay, but Prezi is a web-based platform. It is one of the ways that you can engage millennials visually. They're very used to being visually stimulated, and also to utilize technology. These are polling features, so when Sandra gave the quiz earlier, I heard clicker quizzes. These are some electronic polling features that you can use in your class. To really touch on the bottom level, the understanding and the remembering. These are also good for a large classroom. So a lot of the feedback from faculty members is, how am I giving formative assessment when I have 70 people in the classroom? Well, you can do it by giving problems through one of these platforms, clicker questions, and getting everyone's results right there at the podium, and then you give broad feedback to the classroom about why answer choice A was better than answer choice C. So that's a way to give feedback in a large classroom setting. Application and analysis can happen in a large classroom setting if we are using the Socratic method effectively. And effectively is the key. And I think really the key to this is that application and analysis happens when students apply what they know to a hypothetical set of facts, not simply when they repeat or mimic what they've seen and read in a case. So that in itself is not analysis and application. You'd have to give them something new, but that is a great way to foster the application and analysis in a classroom setting if you're effectively using this Socratic method. And then finally, where we want everyone to be, the evaluation and creation. I like the multi-state performance test. I've used it actually with first-year students for years. It's on over 40 bar exams in this country, in the over 40 jurisdictions, test the multi-state performance test, and it puts students in a real-world lawyering situation. So if you're talking about buzzword experiential learning, the MPT is your thing, and it helps students, it gets students to evaluating and creating by creating a lawyering, a formal work product. So they will be drafting an oral argument or a closing argument, drafting legislation. I mean, the opportunities are endless when it comes to the multi-state performance test, and they already exist, so you don't have to create them, though you might want to edit them. If you're using them with first-year students, it gives them exposure to other areas of law than what they're taking in their classes. And then lastly, have students write multiple choice questions. I'm doing this right now in my bar class, and it's gone over well. This goes back to something James mentioned about chunking, relating what you already know or what you're familiar with to what you're currently learning. I've learned so much about pop culture and just things I don't know about in reading these multiple choice questions. And so when I actually use them in class, I'm like, is this a thing? Am I out of the loop? Because can someone explain to me what this is? Everyone in the class knows who these people are, and I have no idea. So it's a great way to get students involved in really what is chunking, taking their real world experience and their life experience and connecting it to something that's meaningful to their learning while they're creating this MBE style multiple choice question. And so, on that note, thanks again. I think we went a little over time, but hey.
What I'd like to do in the next about 10 minutes is take any questions that you all may have for any of our presenters here on the panel. Anybody have any questions? Yes, in the back.
I'm actually interested in, and I think this might, I'm not going to give it to any particular person because it really might be for more than one person because it concerns Bloom's taxonomy, it concerns sort of cognitive research about learning, and it concerns psychomotor stuff. There's something I teach here, I teach a lot of class, but torch is what I'm going to ask about. It's first semester class here, it's a one semester class, and one of the things I often do, and I have no idea whether it's effective or not, it may be a total waste of time. I enjoy it, the students seem to enjoy it, but I often have students act out cases physically. I mean, we'll get a cast of characters, we'll act out a case, we'll then sort of back up, have them say, act out just the most important facts, the legally relevant dispositive facts, as opposed to the whole script. And then we change the hypothetical by, let's change this, and how does the case look different, et cetera, et cetera. People enjoy doing it, and I think it's fun too. I have no idea whether it furthers learning in any way, shape, or form. It gets people loose, it gets people relaxed, it gets people comfortable being in class, and I think it makes people more comfortable with Socratic learning as well. That being said, should I keep doing it or not? I suppose
I say yes. Particularly, so I'm actually doing the same thing. We did Taboo. Is anybody familiar with the game Taboo? So I did Black Letter Law Taboo in my bar class. And one, for students who, like this goes back to preference, but I think it means something. If you are a kinesthetic learner and you're able to physically be engaged in that part of learning, that's helpful for that group of students. But it also triggers, particularly with millennials, I think a connection. So that's a form of chunking, different from what we would think about traditional chunking. But I think it helps them relate to still some real world experience, drawing a connection between them acting it out and them actually knowing what it is. So I would say yes, don't stop. If nothing else, is engaging if it's fun, and so don't stop for that reason.
And there's also, if you actually do read some of the actual neuroscience, the more neurons you can engage and strengthen, the more different paths, the better the students are learning, the more deeply they're learning.
Well, it made me wonder about the connection between psychomotor activity and cognitive stuff, and sort of having separate categories maybe unrealistic.
And it's actually visual learning too, right, for the people who are watching it. And during orientation, when we have the students brief a case, read a case, brief a case, and we work on just basic case briefing skills, about the second class that we're talking about the case, that particular case and the case briefing skills, we ask the students to cast the movie of the case. We say, if this case were a movie, who would play the plaintiff, who would be the actor who'd put as the plaintiff, and who would be the, the judge, and blah, 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 and all the characters and the witness and everybody. And that way it stays in their heads. And of course in torts, we were always taught, when I was a first year law student, every tort case is just a little human drama, right? And so just to help them remember even the facts of the case, if they can picture it, right? That's active reading skills, if they can picture the case. And we try to teach them in orientation. It's as if you're reading a novel or watching a movie and you're trying to figure out who done it, right? You're trying to anticipate what will the judge say at the end. If you're picturing it as a little drama, then you're anticipating the ending, and again, you're an engaged, active reader, as opposed to, we know how students can become passive readers. So I'd say, yeah, sounds great.
I'd like to add, we have Usually every year we have a Paul's graph enactment.
Yeah, and I changed the package.
It usually turns into a musical, by the way. Because it really lends itself to that. But I wanted to mention something pretty serious about this, is that doing this, doing group work, doing all this stuff takes away time. And people are worried about coverage, especially since we used to probably have 2 semesters of torts. Now we're down to 1 with semesterization of all the first-year courses. But if you're able to really use this to get in depth with the concepts you're teaching, we find that students actually do better on the subjects you don't cover as well, because they're still responsible for them.
May I ask a follow-up, actually, because that triggered a question for me, and then I will shut up. There's another ABA standard, and I forget which one it is, that it has to do with out-of-class time and all that kind of stuff. And in my torts class, frankly, I have made a decision to cover less material more deeply, and that's my strong preference. But part of me wonders whether that's sort of sacrificing how much time students are supposed to be spending outside of class. I mean, I suppose there's other activities I can assign in preparation, so on and so forth. But does anybody else sort of wrestle with that stuff?
Are you teaching first semester?
Yes.
What's interesting about it, whether or not to continue it, what do your evaluations say? No, just kidding. But that's the quintessential law professor answer, right? But I do think it's really important to continue because the science supports it in terms of active versus passive learning, right? Active learning is learning in which the student is engaged in the process. The passive learning is when they sit and just listen to us, right? So by having the students act out, you actually are affecting each level of the cognitive domain of the Bloom's taxonomy. So I think it's a great idea. The second part is we have been talking about the level of content because we have the 2 semester courses. We originally had the 1 semester towards course, moved to 2 semesters, and now want to move away from it to go back to the first semester. And the difficulty is in how do you balance content, right, versus the coverage. How much coverage are you going to do in torts? And the answer is, the most important thing you can do is teach them to be learners, to be critical thinkers. By teaching them to be critical thinkers, they'll pick up the rest, right? So the more in depth you go into the subject matter, you're teaching them to be critical thinkers as it relates to torts. And those skills carry over into other subjects and other disciplines. So my answer is to go as deep as you can with more of a limited array of topics in torts versus the passive coverage of many different topics, and they'll pick it up.
Any other questions? Yes.
I was actually going to follow up on that. For the first time this year, I teach liberal writing. I've done the flipped classroom, which people do a lot, and I don't know why. I've actually taught sessions on it, and I've never used it. I like it, I don't like it either. For the first time, I used it for legislative history, and I had them read the history, the book, and then I ran through it in the library, being videotaped, and then they had to do it. And our classroom time was so much more valuable because I didn't have to go through the steps because they watched it, and one of the students said he watched it like 10 times because he kept getting confused, and then he would backtrack, and then you don't get to do that in the classroom. And so I think sometimes that's a way, for me it's been a way to cover more without, where I can go into depth in the classroom, but the coverage is still broad, if that makes sense. Yep. Yeah, so it's just thought.
Okay, yes.
This is immensely helpful. I teach contracts and commercial law, and I'm increasingly writing things for classroom use. And the most counterintuitive piece from my own experience over teaching the last 20-something years is the idea that millennials learn well with high expectations, because I have found what I'm covering is, and the level at which I'm covering is just going in a downward curve. In part because so many of them are online while I'm teaching, so I have to repeat a lot more and they don't get it. And also
just to close the laptops.
Yeah.
So you mandate the closing of the laptops. You mandate the closing of the laptops, and you make them take manual notes.
And there's really good science behind the fact that they will learn better.
So, and they can get an accommodation if they need an accommodation for a laptop. The next question is then, how do you balance wanting high expectations and an immense amount of support support for basic learning and understanding. If they've only read for 5,000, you know, if they've played video games for twice the amount of time that they've been spending reading, they're not going to be good at reading. And so how can a professor set high expectations when their skill level is so much lower?
So I think one of the things that you can do is hire a great academic support staff, like 5. No, I'm just kidding.
We have it's outstanding. I'm not talking about just the tail of the class. I'm talking about the high tail of the class. I'm talking about the middle of the class. I'm talking about semester after semester. And my colleagues and the people applying to law schools are just different than the people who were applying to law schools before.
I agree.
I mean, generally speaking, the kind of conversation you can have in the classroom is really different.
It's across the board. I think what that means in setting the high expectations is that we have to be explicit. So we're having this conversation about the importance of formative assessment in the classroom and the importance of self-regulated learning and metacognition, and here's how that helps you. We have to be explicit in that skill instruction to the students, right? They want to know, they're not just doing things, millennials particularly, are not just doing it because you're the boss and you're the expert. I'm doing this because how is this benefiting me? I need you to draw the connection between today, my 1L year, between my second and third year of law school, to the bar exam, and to practice. And so when you're able to explicitly educate them about self-regulated learning, and really lawyers are lifelong learners, and here's how this not only looks for you today, but here's the connection to what you will do in this profession.
So it's not a high expectation for the substantive material.
I think you get to the high expectation for the substantive material by being explicit in the process with millennials about the process. So we have a lot of these conversations behind closed doors among ourselves. I'm not sure that many of us are going in a classroom and saying, hey, here are my learning goals, objectives, and I got here because I want you to be a great self-regulated learner. And this is Bloom's taxonomy, and my goal in giving you these assessments is to move you all the way up the taxonomy. So I'm not sure many of us are being that explicit in our instruction about the importance of the skill set with students. And I think that really lends itself then to you setting those high expectations substantively. If they're buying in, but those pieces have to be there. So they have to be a part of your classroom. So if they're buying into the whole process, it allows you to do that. They understand it, they'll do it. So kind of what Alicia was saying, if you are engaging them in the little things and they know how to be learners, they're able to pick up on the things that you might not even cover in the classroom. But if they don't know how to be learners, they're just floating around all semester. You could set low expectations or you could set high expectations. If they don't understand the process of learning for that learning environment, they're still going to be lost.
And
I have a comment about it.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Unfortunately, do you want to, okay, she wants me to, I got to do it.
Okay.
I got to be the bad guy, so we got to move on. Let's say thanks everyone.
I believe that we're going to have about a 5-minute break, and then we'll move on to the next panel.